Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 9th of December 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Nice to see you on again. And thank you very much for taking some of your Tuesday evening out. Hope everybody is well. And I hope the temperatures have eased a bit. I know we've had some issues with fires and high temperatures in some parts of the country. So thoughts out to those people who've been impacted. Today, Robbie is going to join me, and we're going to have an interesting conversation, I think, particularly about the nature of politics in Australia, what needs to change, and why it needs to change, and what's stopping it from changing. So that's going to be the essence of the conversation, but we'll also touch on things like the RBA and their decision today and the economic health of the country and all those things. So it should be a fun but important conversation as well. Just before we bring Robbie in, let me remind you, we're not providing any specific financial, legal, or any other sort of advice. It's a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, suggestions as we go. And if you use that Walk the World DFA, you can get my attention, and that'll make sure I see your questions in my queue. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get to your question to the list, you can do that, or make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate all those who support us via the Super Chat, or via Patreon, or via PayPal. Really does help us to do this. We don't do this for profit. We do this because there's a really important conversation to have and we want to be part of it. And you enable us to have those conversations. So thanks very much for your support. Right, let me bring Robbie straight in. Robbie, welcome back. How are you doing?
Excellent, Martin. As well, for someone living in Australia under the current regime.
Yeah, it is a bit like that, isn't it? And you and I were chatting a bit before we came live to say that the problem we got is that there's a disconnect between what the politicians are saying about what's going on and what is actually going on. And in fact, I made a show the other day, the Australian economic miracle isn't. And that was because when you actually start looking more closely, what you realize is that what they are spinning, and I call Jim Chalmers Spin Jim these days, is so far disconnected from the reality as to be just surprisingly untrue. And what I'm want to, as we kick this around a bit tonight, it amazes me that there is this political play for the media grab and the sort of the headline. Never mind whether it's true or whether it's false, no. and so there's a real question about where truth lays. And sometimes I think that the under 16 social media ban and the other issues about trying to control what people see, and it's partly perhaps because they don't really want to have some of this stuff out there. They just want to be able to spin their way to glory. But the truth is, of course, that things are far from great for many people. I see that in my surveys. The RBA, of course, today made the announcement of the cash rate unchanged. And they did concede that the inflationary pulse perhaps was more persistent and needs to be monitored closely. They did go on to say that the labour market conditions remain tight, wages growth eased from its peak, and they basically went on to say that there is uncertainty outlook and, they'll have to monitor what's going on. I thought Warren Hogan actually came into this quite nicely when he said, is the RBA behind the curve, as the saying goes? Well, the 10-year bond yield is one bad day from the highest interest rate in 15 years. Answer is literally yes, they are behind the yield curve. If nothing else, it brings into question the wisdom of the rate cuts this year and the RBA's unwillingness to be forward-looking, leaving them at the mercy of the data. So that's the sort of the first, slug, and I think that's probably right. And then, of course, you've got things like this: the average first home buyer can then afford to buy 12% of homes nationally, compared to almost a third of homes 5 years ago, which is a stunningly chilling thought. And then Steve Keen posted this, and I think this is actually right. The quiet wealth transfer that is going on at the moment. So you've got the poor old labourer, now the average Joe, working and trying to save, and then you've got the wealth being hoovered up by the capital owners, right?
Yeah.
And you may have seen this because there were two headlines from the Wall Street Journal side by side, pretty much. The world has more billionaires than ever, in the US. Majority of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. So something is wrong, fundamentally wrong. And if another angle on this, this came up, $1,700 each in terms of taxpayer interest rates because of the federal government debt. So there's the high debt. And then you've got things like the Wells travel bill, and we're going to get onto that shortly. It doesn't actually seem to be really.
let the meat, let the meat cake.
Well, one rule for them, one rule for us, as it were. And all of those things seem to me to, it points to the thing. Things aren't right. And then look at the data, right? So if you look at, this is the NAB business confidence, it's down. Both business conditions and business confidence is down. If you look at household spending, it's sort of splurged up, but that was because things were offered cheap to people to buy. But compared with back when it was in 2023, it's no better. Dwelling approvals way below where it needs to meet our target, despite the fact that people are pushing people to say, you build more apartments, build up. All of this, and the latest GDP says, well, we're in economic burnout, really. We're throwing a lot of government money at things, but not getting much. And a lot of the jobs growth is actually in the public sector rather than the private sector. And guess what? The cash rate projections are going to go higher. And then, of course, just the final spin, AUKUS. AUKUS is full steam ahead. It's great for the US, but not necessarily for us. And if you just want to see what that means, do you see this? This is the current contracts out.
Yeah,
Department of Defense, $58.7 billion. That's taxpayer money to the Department of Defense. And in fact, there was a very good article in Michael West that Rex Patrick wrote, rearranging deck chairs on the HMS Titanic. So I guess when I put all that together, I've got this question in my mind, because you've got this political world where Jim Chalmers came out to say, oh, the inflation blip's just temporary and everything's fine, strong wages growth. But the reality for ordinary Australians is they're paying more tax, they can't find anywhere to live, and for them, the political process is bust, because the political process is irrelevant to how people are actually living their lives. So I'm struggling with this, and I'm hoping that perhaps we can have a conversation about that and why it is that essential services are being whipped away, and why it is that politics are just, disconnected, frankly.
Well, I'm sorry I'm laughing, Mark, but that your little montage there is one of the best things. That's your short for the show right there. That was really good. There's Australia in a nutshell. Go and commit suicide, everybody.
Well, no, don't do that, because Australia's a great country, right?
Sorry,
and I will make the point. Did you see this? I thought this was interesting. The truth is that the top 15 safest countries in the world, Australia is second. So Australia still has a lot going for it from sort of safety and security. And so that means why we've got more migrants coming in. By the way, more people don't want more migration. So there's, the latest survey shows, which is really interesting. But the point is, it's not working. The way that things are set up at the moment is not working for ordinary Australians who are having to spend a lot more. So how do we get out of this bind?
Yeah, and I apologize for that use of the word before, because I don't want to trigger the algorithm. That was a throwaway line. I shouldn't have used it. And Australians shouldn't do that. We need to hang in there and fight. But we've got to figure out what to do. And for those who are watching, if you haven't watched Martin and I for what is it, 7 years, Martin?
Yes, it is.
If you go back through Martin Walk the World to 2018 and look at the first ever show Martin and I did together, where Martin interviewed me at length on the Citizens Party's policies, and the theme I keep coming back to it, Martin, because we are paying for the legacy of neoliberalism. Because what neoliberalism did was dismantled an economy in which there was a public presence in the economy that kept the corporate power under control, and made sure that for the better part, not, nothing's ever perfect in an economy, but for the better part, there was a commitment in the economy to serving the people. And neoliberalism swept the world and just dismantled all those kind of public structures, handed it all over to private corporate power, and they have plundered us for profit ever since, for the best part of 40 years, odd, probably even more in some cases. And at a certain point, you reach the bottom of the barrel. If your system is based on plundering and looting, you reach the bottom of the barrel. And the bottom of the barrel is what you're struggling to pay in your mortgage, to pull together to pay in your mortgage payments every month. That's actually what's happening. And I think Steve Keen with his cartoon there, I wouldn't be surprised if he's on the same wavelength. Is it this Promi guy, Gary's Economics? Have I got that? Is that the guy? He's someone who's, I believe he's visiting Australia early next year, but he's someone who's worked in the city and come out and said that in his view, what you've got now is capital just devouring the whole economy, because you've got to have money. It's the old adage, you've got to have money to make money, right? And those with the money are just making money like you wouldn't believe, hand over fist. But there's no middle class anymore, and they've hollowed it out, and the rest of us are just on struggle street. And this is an economy, especially in the Western world, that's geared for the plutocrats at the top, right? And this is the legacy of neoliberalism, because they broke. You used to have, as a result of decades of political debates going back into the 19th century, you used to have public institutions that were there for the public good. And that's what was dismantled by neoliberalism. And once that's all gone, then you're left with, I think, just the mess we're in. If you want an example on housing, to me, look at, I was in Adelaide on Saturday. We had a citizens party event over there because we've been on a membership drive, and we've qualified to be registered in South Australia. Not that it does you much good, because that's a rigged electoral system if ever there was one. Call out to anyone from South Australia watching. And but I was speaking to the audience there and pointing out to them that their state is actually famous for something that was just a brilliant episode in Australian history, which was the South Australian Housing Trust, because this was a public institution that, once it was up and started, did not cost the taxpayer of South Australia a cent. It was self-funding, but it was the biggest property developer in the state. It built a third of the houses in the state, made sure that they were either for sale or rent at incredibly affordable prices, less than 20% of income. How's that? How would that compare to your survey today, Mark?
Oh,
Right,
well, a lot of people at 50%. And,
right.
remember that in my surveys and analysis, I look at not gross income, but net available income after tax,
Mm,
right?
mm.
Because a lot of people, of course, when they look at these figures, are taking gross income, but the tax take has almost never been higher. And so more people are actually starting with a smaller pot of money, and then they have to pay a larger proportion of it for their mortgage or indeed their rent. And in my surveys, 45 to 55% of available income going just to pay for a roof is horrible. And
It's a cancer in our economy.
it is.
It's the cancer that's eating us away. It's how can you live like this?
Hmm. Well, what it means is, of course, people have less money to spend on other things.
Yep,
It means that they, in some cases, are cutting back on the quality of the food that they're actually buying, and
yep,
they're buying
yep.
more ultra processed food, which leads then to worse health outcomes.
Health problems. Yep,
Right? You've got people also working more jobs. So the latest data show that there were, again, a lot of people working 2 jobs or more jobs, working more hours, trying to get by. So effectively, working harder than ever before to try and get by. And the other interesting observation, did you know that now, of course, the assumption by the banks when they come to actually assess a mortgage is it's 2 full incomes. So when people talk about housing affordability, they automatically assume 2 people are working full time. Now, if you go back
yeah,
20 to 30 years, it would be 1 income and a bit of the second income, and that would be the
yep,
sort of the
yep.
3 times calculation. But now it's 6 or 7 times 2 full-time incomes. So,
And if you go back even further than that, I'm not even sure how the mechanism worked. I know how the American mechanism works, but we were a country where you could get 30-year fixed rate mortgages like America.
yeah,
My parents bought their first house that way in the 60s. And you didn't get ripped off on your mortgage. But I saw the figures the other day from the Australia Institute that owner occupied housing is 27% of the bank's assets, but 39% of their profits. That's how much they're raking out of mortgages from the people who need the housing the most, and the system is rigged in their favor.
Mm.
And they're the entity that you and I have butted heads with as we've worked together for 7 years.
And it's interesting to know APRA, of course, has come out and now said that they are worried about the mortgage exposure, particularly for investment properties. So they're actually bringing in this 20% rule, 20% over a certain, only over a certain level of debt to income ratio for the first time next February. But as somebody said, it's like having a speed limit at 200 miles an hour, right? The chances are no bank's going to get to actually have to worry too much about it. But it is interesting that they play lip service to the problem, but then actually don't do anything to address it. And of course, the APRA mob don't look at household indebtedness in the same way that I do. They look at it from a financial stability risk perspective.
Well, remember, Martin, APRA was split off from the RBA in 1998. The RBA's remit is inflation and full employment. APRA's remit is financial stability. Now, I'd like to just mention this. We talked about this again recently because last year we had a big victory over Jim Chalmers because we stopped Jim Chalmers repealing Section 11 of the RBA Act that gives the Treasurer the right to override the RBA monetary policy. And your regular viewers remember that we gave the history of it. This was a power that Curtin and Chifley enacted in 1945. It had never been used, but it was based on the principle that the democratically elected government should be the ultimate power in the financial system, not the unelected bankers. But there was another section of the RBA's power that was from Section 36 of the Banking Act that said the RBA can give lending guidance to the banks and basically say, stop lending so much to investors, right? Lend more for small business, lend more for owner occupiers. They can give that kind of guidance. They can't tell them which loans to make, but they can give that kind of guidance. But when they split off the APRA in 98, they gave APRA that power as well. And the understanding is it was a bit of an anachronism that it was still with the RBA too. The RBA has never used it. APRA has used it, but that was in 2014. APRA implemented then a bit of a break on investor lending in 2014, and that brought down the percentage of loans to investors, which had hit a high. I think it hit a high in mid 2015 of 48%, something like that, very close to half of the loans, and that brought it down to close to 20% by 2020. But since 2020, it's just turned around and gone right back up again. Right, and that's why it's an issue again. Senator Barbara Pocock called for APRA to step in and use its powers. Saul Eslake, the former ANZ chief economist, called for APRA to step in and use its powers. But as you said, it has a different motive than the RBA. The motive, if the RBA was actively using this power, it should have stepped in ages ago and done it to control inflation, because this lending to investors is driving up housing prices and contributing to inflation. But the APRA motive is financial stability. And so perversely, the more profitable, the way they calculate it, the more profitable banks are, they just say, well, the more stable they are. And if this is contributing to the profitability, so it takes a lot for APRA to actually step in and do something. Meanwhile, what's the overarching reality that now Jim Chalmers has to deal with? Inflation's back, if it was ever actually properly tamed. I don't think, of course, it actually wasn't. What they did is they papered over it with these rebates, electricity rebates. Now, of course, call me cynical, Martin, but this week, Jim Chalmers announced he's doing the right thing. It's the right decision to not continue the rebates. Why is it the right decision now and not 6 months ago? Can anyone tell? What message from the economic gods was handed down on Mount Sinai in the form of tablets to Jim Chalmers to make it the right decision now? Well,
Well,
it's the right decision now because there's not an election for 3 years.
spot on,
That's why,
spot on. That it
right?
suppressed suppressed inflation through the election cycle, and therefore they got more votes because of it. It was our money, our taxpayer money,
Yep, yep.
and it's what
Now
six
it's
six
let the
point eight billion or something. I mean, it's quite a large number. I think it was.
Now, can I say the only state where it wasn't quite like that is Queensland, because Queensland still owns its own electricity assets.
Yep.
So in that case, and if all the states did, just provide electricity at cost, for crying out loud, right? But again, this goes to my earlier point. This is part of the privatisation of electricity was part of the dismantlement. Now, however, Queensland's going to shoot up the most because even though the Queensland government owns its own electricity assets, they're governed by this law called National Competition Policy. And national competition policy means because those power stations in Queensland are plugged into the same grid as the private power stations in New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia, essentially, then they're all competing with each other. And those government-owned power stations in Queensland are not allowed by law to outcompete the privately owned ones. And so they have to artificially charge more for their electricity to Queensland customers than they otherwise would, just so they don't. That's how national competition policy works. And this is so when they brought in neoliberalism, Martin, they didn't just take away the government institutions that protected us. They put actual shackles on what was left of government institutions and said, you will not make the private sector look bad. The private sector is there for profit, and your role as the government is to help them make as much profit as possible. And that's why the Australian version of those cartoons that you showed is we don't have as many obvious. We've got quite a few billionaires here, obviously, but we're not American style billionaires. What do we have? We have the most profitable corporations in the world. So we're in a cost of living crisis. Every sector of our economy is dominated by a handful of corporations, whether it be banking or insurance or supermarkets or airlines. Airlines. I mean, I'm itching to get on to Annika Wells, but just as a quick one, we won't get to the full Annika Wells story yet, but airlines, for crying out loud, it turns out, cut Annika a little bit of slack, it really does cost that much to fly business class to New York. It really does. And I'm not someone who begrudges a government minister flying business class. I think, of course, you should fly business class. We are so ripped off by airlines in this country that if you have to book a flight to New York business class with no time, just in a hurry, they're going to slug you $30,000 to do it. There's a sign up over Australia that says they're already bent over, boys, come and do them. Right? And every corporation's bloody taking advantage of us. That is the Australian story. And for me, it comes back to this question of the legacy of neoliberalism, which was just breaking down these public institutions and handing everything carte blanche over to the private sector and corporations. And they're the two major parties, especially, are indebted to them. And I just want to make a quick comment before we go on about the what you said about the way the politics of this is always such bullshit, because you don't have a proper level of engagement among the major politicians. All they're looking for is what soundbite can they come up with to deliver to the media. The media is this prism that distorts the reality both ways, to the politicians and from the politicians. And they're this prism in the middle. And they define, and I know this, I've been in Parliament enough. I see the way these guys operate. It's about what spin can we come up with for the media to look like that we're on top of this issue, whatever the issue is. It's not about being actually on top of it. How do we look like we're on top of it? And I met a former Labor ministerial staffer during the election, who was happily a former one, and he told me how his job as a ministerial staffer was in charge of announceables, because when problems would come on the minister's plate, they had to come up with something they could announce, not to solve them, but to fit in with the news cycle so they could move on to some other problem. Right? No wonder we're going down the gurgler as a country. And our party, for one, is trying very hard to change that, starting with focusing on real things with real solutions so that we get people used to the idea of understanding what outcomes will be. It's just that I've got a few complaints about the process because clearly what we've done is good work, but we keep running into this brick wall the way politics operates in Australia.
Yes, and unfortunately, the political structure is where power lies. Like it or not, that's the way that democracy works. Unfortunately, I would argue that democracy isn't working that well. It's worth just thinking about how much a majority Labor got on what basis of the vote, firstly,
Yep.
right? Secondly, when you actually look at what they said they were going to do versus what they are doing, and when you look at Labor historically and Labor's centre of gravity in terms of its policy set, and you compare it with what they've actually got now, they've gone way off track because the neoliberal, hand up the arm or up, wobbling the head or whatever,
Up the arse.
Yeah, I nearly said it, but didn't quite. But you did. But that's the point, right? So neoliberalism is still effectively in play. When you look at the amount of tax breaks that the large corporations have in Australia, I'm talking the gas, I'm talking the minerals, I'm pretty much wherever you look, right? They are not paying their fair share of tax. They have not paid their fair share of tax, and they're getting massive tax breaks. That's a real problem because more and more of the funding for government is coming out of ordinary Australian pockets through taxes. If you look at the government expenditure, it's continuing to expand. And, there's no real intent to rein that in, lip service, et cetera, but no real intent because they're spending a lot of money, but they're not spending it wisely. And I'm not somebody who is completely against governments investing in things for the future. But I am worried when effectively most of the money that is being spent is just covering day-to-day expenditure, the NDIS or whatever it is, or the growth in the public sector and the quasi-public, I showed you that earlier chart, because it is not laying a productive future for Australia. And if you look at the productivity measures, we're completely all over the place. I remember Jim Chalmers holding that conference in Canberra a few months ago, and all this productivity, well, that went nowhere, didn't it? Productivity is a real problem. Productivity means that we're actually not creating more wealth for the population. And in fact, if you adjust productivity for growth in population, it's going backwards still. So effectively, we're bringing more people into the country to feed this machine, but it's not actually being more productive. And therefore, we are not, as a society, benefiting from all of this stuff. So the question is, well, who is benefiting? Large corporates. A lot of those large corporates, of course, not necessarily even based in Australia. A lot of our profits go overseas. If you look at the investors in the banks, for example, a lot of that is money going overseas. So there's a sort of big exit of profits taken out from Australia. Meanwhile, ordinary Australians, high housing, as we discussed earlier, and the tax take. And just coming back to the one thing you mentioned, the property investor story. I don't know whether you saw this, but I actually made a show the other day with John Wright. He's at UTS, and he's a professor, associate professor. And he spoke very firmly about the fact that what he calls the carry trade in property, this is property investors, they are the real problem with regard to the way that the property market has worked for the last 20 to 30 to 40 years. It's deliberate policy, supporting the banks, supporting public policy, well, maybe, but not supporting real Australians. So he used the Terminator movie as an analogy and say, you've got to actually kill the machine, right? Because the machine is going to kill us. And that's the problem, I think, with this whole story, right? Because the way the policy settings are at the moment, there's a small proportion of people doing very well, but a lot of ordinary people who are not. And there is no way out of the hole unless you actually change direction. So the question is, how do we actually create the political momentum and political will to change direction? Because that ultimately is what we have to do, right? And unfortunately, my perspective is, and we did some great work with regards to branch closures, for example, and highlighted through the Senate inquiry that this was a real problem. They made some very, very good recommendations about what should be done. So that was all good. And then crickets. And what we're seeing again and again and again is
Yep.
ideas coming up that could actually make a significant positive difference, but they don't go anywhere.
Well, let's explore that, because I think if people understood it as well as we did, they will be clear why we keep coming back to this corporate power, and from then that's why you focus on it. And that's why, just as an aside, I understand the mathematics of mass immigration, but I'm not interested in talking about it, because I want people to understand, because it's too easy to distract people by blaming their Indian neighbor, right? And a lot of people talk about massive. They're not really meaning to do that, but there are plenty of people who are. And what they're not getting, if you focus on your fellow man rather than this unnatural entity called corporate power, you're not going to actually solve the problem. And so let's just look at this particular example. But can we start off, because I think a good way to get into it, Martin, is to talk about Annika Wells, because I want to join the pile on Annika Wells, right? This woman is the amount of money, taxpayers' money, that she has absolutely wasted. Now, you wouldn't believe how much money it is, and I'll tell you how much money it is. Let me just so it is. Do you know it's about $7.5 million is what she has wasted? Now, some people who are paying attention should be surprised that I've said that, because you're thinking, well, I've seen the list of her travel expenses. It doesn't add up to $7.5 million. There's the list there, right? That doesn't add up to $7.5 million. Where does that figure come from? Well, that figure is much more important than those figures you can see on the screen. Because like I've said, the $95,000 is actually a legitimate expense. And, the rest of it, I actually don't like the pylons. I understand it. And the reason I don't like the pylon, Martin, is because I think everyone probably knows that Annika Wells' expenses she's not the only one of the 227 members of parliament, right, with those expenses. This is a universal problem. And so there's a reason she's been singled out at the moment.
Sorry, Robbie, just one point. They claim they are within the rules, right? So the rules are wrong, but that's a different question, right? The rules are wrong, but sorry, go back to your main point.
Especially for ministers.
Yeah, exactly right. But the point is, they are wrong in the first place, so they should be completely changed because it's ridiculous. But that's not the real story here, is it?
No. The real story, if she's going to go down, I don't want her going down for flying her kids to meet her at some stupid event because she's a minister. I don't want her going down for that. I want her going down, Martin, for the fact that she is the Communications Minister of Australia, and the CEO of Australia Post, which she owns on our behalf, has closed 202 post offices and is on his way to close 118 more. And every one he closes guts the community he pulls it out of. And he's doing it, and he's been to make a profit so that he can be paid a massive bonus. And she approved a bonus for him of $1.6 million to take his pay to $3.3 million. And he's got a team of 8 executives, and they got between $600,000 and $800,000 each for this vandalism of an essential service for Australians. Utter vandalism. Now, we broke the story of Christine Holgate back in 2020, what was really going on there. We turned around public opinion. That woman was pilloried. She was driven to be suicidal. There was a cartoon written of her in the Financial Review depicting her as a prostitute because she had 4 executives who worked with her night and weekends and public holidays to make the banks pay money for once for Australia Post, serving them in post offices. And she rewarded those 4 executives with cheap bloody Cartier watches of $5,000 each. Cheap. $20,000 she spent. And those utter bastards, starting in the Labor Party and in the Liberal Party, couldn't destroy her fast enough. We cleared her name starting with what the work we did at the Citizens Party and what we did on this show with you and me, right? We turned around public opinion. We got an inquiry. We got 2 inquiries going into it. They both cleared her. And then those utter bastards went and put in Paul Graham as CEO so she couldn't get her job back. And since he's been CEO, he has closed 202 post offices. Michelle Rowland was the communications minister before Annika Wells. She did nothing about it. And now Annika Wells has taken over. And I can tell you, I talked to the post office people. They have been reaching out to her the whole time she's been communications minister. Nothing, nada, zilch, nothing. Not interested. Her fellow Labor members of Parliament, Martin, get up in Parliament. Peter Khalil, Jiju, the member for Banks, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Sharon Clayton, I think her name is, from Newcastle. Labor members of Parliament take up the cause of the post office closures in their community, and their own colleague can do something about it because they own Australia Post. They are the shareholders, right? This is bizarre, absolutely bizarre. And if she's going to go down, she better bloody go down for that, because these are. I live in Glenroy. They have one of the post offices is the Glenroy Post Office. 2 years later, there's still a campaign here in Glenroy to bring back their post. I'm actually not part of the campaign, believe it or not. I probably know more about post offices than anyone in Australia outside of Australia Post. I'm not part of that campaign. That's just a purely grassroots community campaign to bring back their post office. They are so destroyed, devastated without it. And she could have done something. Her predecessor could have done something. Anthony Albanese could do something. Katie Gallagher is the finance minister, the other shareholder minister of Australia Post. She could do something. But they've done nothing, absolutely nothing, and they don't care. And this guy, they've given him a bonus for doing this. And that's where the $7.5, you add up those bonuses, that's $7.5 million of public money paid to vandals, saboteurs, people who are destroying public infrastructure, public services, right? This is crazy. And there is a solution, Martin. There is something that they could do that would be a win-win and tick every box and solve this. And that is what we achieved with the campaign on. So I'll calm down now because I've been busting to explode on this all day. This is, when I see an injustice like this, and I'm torn because I'm almost sorry for her having to deal with this expenses scandal, and I want her political execution to be for a just cause, right? What she's actually culpable for, not what every other politician's doing. But Martin, ask yourself this: why aren't the media and the opposition going after her for post offices?
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
See, this thing on Annika Wells, this is a policy-free zone. It's just a political pylon. They love this shit, right? If they took her on for policy, what's the truth? The truth is they're in on it too. They are culpable in this. This is the evil of the uni party, which is what we have to destroy. And that's where I think the story of what we did on bank branch closures is instructive for how we've proven the case that there is a controlling entity in politics that's anti-democratic, and we have to destroy that. So we went from the Christine Holgate campaign, and you remember this well. So we finished. She didn't get a job back. This bastard got appointed, and then we met. But we had been introduced to that idea of what happens with branch closures, because one of the things Christine achieved at Australia Post is they were going to shut down Bank at Post. That is the board of Australia Post, and she was the only person who intervened and said no. She was a brand new CEO. She said no. There's 1,500 communities in Australia that only have Bank at Post for post banking services. And so that's when I first started paying attention to this question of what is the distribution of banking services in Australia. And then Dale Webster, the independent journalist in Bendigo, had, just as the Christine Holgate campaign is coming to a bit of an end because of the end of the inquiry, Dale Webster published this devastating series of articles about regional branch closures. And we started looking at this and realizing these bloody banks, the most profitable banks in the world, they are just committing carnage out there, ripping out banks in country towns, leaving hundreds and hundreds of country towns without any banks at all. And the impact of that is enormous. It is devastating what happens to country towns when they lose their bank. So that led to there was eventually we got the new government in, and working with Senator Gerard Rennick, who was still in the Liberal Party then, we got the inquiry up into branch closures. Now, what I was able to witness better than anybody else in Australia, because I attended every hearing, for the next 15 months, I saw what I consider the best of Parliament in operation. So you had politicians from all parties represented on the committee that was looking at this question. They started off pretty naive. I had firm ideas before. I came into this thing knowing what the issue, what the problem was, and what the solution was. We got into it because we wanted to use it as a vehicle to show, look, the solution here is a bank in post offices. Bring back a government bank, put it in post offices. It instantly serves all communities. It forces the big four banks to compete. We'll have a better financial system if we did that. That's what we went in there to prove. I couldn't dictate the outcome though, right? I was just trying to help agitate to make sure this thing worked, and I attended every hearing. I watched these senators get better and better and better as the hearings went on. And what made them better is how bad the banks were. They went into those hearings, Martin, giving the banks the benefit of the doubt. And the banks gave them such obvious bullshit answers that the senators got angrier and angrier and angrier. And by the end, none of the senators, not even the Liberals who spent their whole life kissing banks' asses, none of the senators were on the side of the banks. And they produced a devastatingly effective report with great recommendations. And the second recommendation was establish an expert panel to look at this solution of bringing back a government bank. That was the second recommendation. And it's a perfectly reasonable ask. It wasn't the recommendation wasn't establish a government bank, because it's up to the government to decide its own policy. The recommendation was, hey, establish an expert panel to look at this. Now, that report, Martin, was handed in May 2024. A year earlier, or less than a year earlier, in August 2023, as we discovered later, Anthony Albanese was on a podcast with Neil Mitchell here in Melbourne, and he said, one, he would never have privatised the Commonwealth Bank, and two, you need a government bank to provide the competitive tension to keep the private banks honest. He gave the best possible rationale for a public bank you could come up with. The sitting Prime Minister of Australia. So that's his view. The head of the government, when this report was handed down, recommending an expert panel look at this idea to take the banks on. So that's his position. August 2024, the Australian headline came out and said, Post Office Bank back on Labor's agenda. That was the headline. And it referenced the fact that Bill Shorten, when he was the opposition leader, had also wanted this. So here you got Labor in power after wanting this in 2019. They're now in power. They've got a report that tells them this is the solution that you should consider for this urgent problem that they agree is an urgent problem, which is the devastation of banking services. So you've got that whole mix there. You've got someone leaked to the Australian newspaper that this is something that they want to do, right? And as you said, what's happened next? Crickets. Something has intervened in the process to actually stop this from happening. I don't think we could have done any more than we did. We handed them this solution to a problem that they acknowledge on a platter, but nothing. And what you see as the explanation is, I can tell you, corporate power. Now, we got to see it live. And I mentioned this on one of our recent discussions a few months ago, just this example. We got to see live an example of how the banks just openly dictate to the Albanese government. I was in Parliament House with Glenn Ishwood, my colleague. John Adams was there. We'd caught up with John Adams, and we also met a mutual acquaintance from the Greens, Fraser Brindley, who's sadly passed away. And it was on I think it's the 22nd of November or 23rd of November 2023. And Fraser Brindley was excited because that day, Jim Chalmers had agreed to implement the financial accountability regime recommendation of the Hayne Royal Commission that the bank executives individually should be held accountable through $1 million fines. So it's not just the bank paying the fine, the bank executives who are the criminals, they pay the fine. And Labor agreed to that. And the headline in the Sydney Morning Herald was $1 million fines for bankers. The very next day, 24 hours later, the headline in the Sydney Morning Herald was Labor drops $1 million fine for bankers, something like that. What happened? Anna Bligh, the head of the Banking Association, picked up the phone to Jim Chalmers. The big four bank CEOs picked up the phone to Jim Chalmers, and they said, no, you will not do this. We They actually said if you institute a system where dodgy bank executives get charged $1 million fines, we will not be able to recruit bank executives. That's actually what they said to Jim Chalmers. In other words, we specialize in recruiting dodgy bank executives. Don't take that away from us. And it worked. Labor dropped it like that. And I can tell you something else has happened similar with this policy fight that we've been on, where we did everything right. This wasn't just agitating, with big rallies in front of Parliament, trying to scare them into submission, that sort of thing. That's not what we did. We made the parliamentary process work the way it should. Proper considered analysis of the problem, properly hearing from the victims of the problem, properly delving into what the solution is, getting all the best testimony they could, etc. I was able to testify with Glenn Isherwood on this subject, right? We made the system work as well as it ever has, and it's hit a bloody brick wall, which is this corporate power that we must smash, because it's the corporate power that defines the uni party. And that's why the Citizens Party as a party, since that process, we are pushing ahead with this. We're not going to back off from this policy and trying to get it implemented. But one of the things that we've looked ourselves in the face and in the mirror and realized, well, probably the only way we're going to achieve policy change is we have to make an electoral impact, because only then are you in the position to actually scare the two major parties, such that Labor actually goes ahead and implements something that their current leader and their former leader are both on record saying they wanted, right? And are prepared to do something instead of just bow the knee to the banks. So our party, we're on a big membership drive at the moment. We're talking with other parties about how we can work together, etc. The reason that we think we have to do it, though, because we've got to, I'm happy to work with all other parties, but what I find with other parties, Martin, is they're so easily distracted by sideshows, and they get into all the sort of woke debates and stuff like that, and it rages on both sides, and none of those make a difference to people's lives, none of it, right? This stuff that is why people are being crushed by the cost of living, right? Because we have a banking system that's so all powerful they can just gouge us at will, whether it's housing or everything else they do, and not providing services. The government won't. We have to break that. We have to get to make sure the government stands up to that, and we've got to get people to focus on it. And so that's our intention as a party. And if we don't, what happens if we continue going the way we do? Because remember, you mentioned something else I haven't talked about. That not only is everything as bad as your montage back then showed, but on top of that, as bad as everything is in Australia, we're giving away $1 trillion to the Americans for submarines we'll never see, called in a ridiculous program called AUKUS. The latest person to come out and say it's a ridiculous program is the top naval guy, admiral in the United Kingdom, Admiral Matthias, who was the head of the nuclear program in the English Navy. He just said AUKUS is just not deliverable at all, full stop. It's not going to happen. Yet we are. There was a press conference today with that idiot Pete Hegseth, Richard Marles and Penny Wong, and they all took turns saying full steam ahead, right? And we handed over another $1 billion while people in Australia are struggling to put food on the table. And that's not to mention the $1.4 trillion we're handing over to them in our super to make America great again. And there's a corporate angle on that too, Martin, because the military-industrial complex, which is making all this money from weapons, they're not government departments. They're private companies. They're called BAE Systems, Northrop Grumman, McDonnell Douglas. What's the other big American one? Anyway, you know all the names of them, right? They're raking it in, and everything we're handing over to them is going into those corporations, right? And they're distorting the whole policy. And then I've got to tell you this: I want to take exception to one of your little graphs. because, and I don't want to make an issue out of, last time we talked about China in great length, but I want to make 2 points about China. One is China has 90% home ownership. 90% home ownership. And they did have a housing bubble. And the Chinese government deliberately engineered the popping of that housing bubble because it was a massive problem in the economy. And they said, we're not going to put up with this problem anymore. And they brought all the resources to bear to make sure they could reduce their housing bubble. They got 90% home ownership in China, the country that we're going to go to war against, on behalf of these corporations that are gouging us so we can't afford homes. And the graph I want to take exception to is the graph that had Australia as the second safest country in the world, because China wasn't even on that. And I can tell you now, I was there. China is the safest country in the world by a million miles. You go to China, you put down your purse anywhere in the street, walk away for 5 hours, you'll come back and it's there. There's no crime to speak of in China. It is the one thing that seems to seduce Western women in particular when they go to China is just how safe they start to feel. The people who make graphs like that are so Eurocentric, they're up their own asses. We are being made to hate and fear and want to go to war against a country that's actually, I can give you another, don't believe me, as I said last time, go and see it for yourself, but it is not the country that you think it is. If they've got 90% home ownership and the safest country in the world, then why are we hating them so much? And being prepared to spend so much money on it. But anyway, to me, it comes back to we've reached this point where if we don't break the corporate power that's strangling our democracy, because we don't have a democracy while it's there, right? What I've just tried to show you in this lengthy example is we, and when I say we, the Citizens Party, you, Martin, and the people we work with that worked on this campaign, we did everything in our power to make the democratic process in Australia work the way it should. We bring it right up to the point of getting a policy where all it needs to do is be enacted. And then bang, we're up against this invisible force field. And there's no obvious explanation to it, except experience tells you what it is. It's the fact that we've got a uni party of two major parties the opposition will bag each of the other guys over expenses in a policy-free way, because they don't want to talk about policies because they're on the same page when it comes to policies generally, except for every now and then there's a big blow-up over something like net zero. But in general, these neoliberal policies are on the same page, and they're indebted to the same big corporate powers, and they're not going to buck that system. And that's why we need a movement of the people to smash that power.
Yeah, and it's just worth going back in history. If you think of the earlier attempt from the Labour Party to put in the minerals resources rent tax that got basically thrown out because of the power of those big industry players and their threats and what they would do.
Their muscles.
And then, of course, the gas industry, which, of course, are 4 or 5 large international entities charging like wounding bulls for gas that we produce in Australia, and then forcing effectively Australians to pay the full international price, which is why electricity prices are so high. Again, it's the power of those large corporates. And I could go through the grocery sector, supermarkets, airlines, telecommunications. There's the whole string of these large players who have way, way too much power. And that power is often used discreetly and behind the veil through lobbying. But also the politicians know that if they go in that direction, they're going to upset them. So they don't even go there in the first place. So they've almost got this invisible force field around the whole of Australia and the political environment that we've got. And the truth is that there are a small number of very significant winners out of this, but a large number of very unfortunate losers. But it's not that transparent. And then when you hear the election cycle coming and democracy, etc., what this says to me, Robbie, is that democracy, whilst it's really important, is a little bit of a shadow box at the moment.
Well, what is democracy? Democracy is how you're supposed to ascertain the will of the people, right? That's what democracy is. And the whole thing has become a charade. Now, so can I tell you, I got to tell you this. The Citizens Party, as I said, we're on a membership drive. And so we've been flat out on membership drive since the federal election, because the election taught us that. Well, we went into the election, Martin, with the view, look at what we've done as a party for the last 6 or 7 years, and we put out a really good flyer. Who are the Citizens Party? What have they ever done for you? And we detailed all these different fights. We stopped the cash ban. We stopped Jim Chalmers over repealing democratic over accountability over the RBA. We exposed bail-in, and we forced the bail-in thing to a big vote. We introduced multiple pieces of legislation into Parliament, right? One for a Glass-Steagall separation of banks, one for the government auditor to audit the banks instead of the accounting firms like PwC and those corrupt ones, right? We did all these things, and they were big important fights. The really impressive one though was the Christine Holgate campaign, and what that showed about Australia Post, but also the regional branch closures inquiry and what that achieved. And so we thought, okay, our party has done an enormous body of work here. And we did it in a certain way where we're prepared to work with everybody, where we have common ground. One of the reasons we're able to work with everybody, Martin, is because we're the one party in the room. If there's more than one party in a room, we're the one that's prepared not to take credit, right? And unfortunately, because we're dealing with a lot of egotistical people, and they always want credit, and we want the outcome. And so that meant that when election came around, despite people know us, relative to what we needed, hardly anybody knew us, right? And we thought, okay, we need a much bigger actual mass movement. That's why we've been on this membership drive. So the big challenge was to get registered in New South Wales. New South Wales is the hardest state to get registered in. You need 750 members at a state level, but that's not just what's hard, because other states have like 500, 300, that sort of thing. But it's the way they verify your membership in New South Wales. So we've had an office in Penrith where Craig Isherwood, our National Secretary, has been shuttling back and forth from Melbourne, leading a team of volunteers from New South Wales, manning that office, calling people. And it's really exhausting, because you've got to get people in the New South Wales to go onto the Electoral Commission's portal and physically register themselves, like electronically register themselves individually, and they all have to be verified. Anyway, and so you literally, and you got to have a buffer. So you don't just go for 750, you go for 800 or 850 or whatever. You got to have a buffer. And we did all this. We did all this work. We met the requirement, and then we were the first party to go through this new process, and straight away you realise, well, okay, why is it a new process? Well, the existing parties in Parliament have changed the law to make a new process. But what you got to understand, when the existing parties in Parliament, Martin, changed these laws, and something similar happened before the federal election at a federal level, do you know the laws, especially for registration, the laws never apply to the major parties. They never have to go through this registration process, they never have, because if you've got members in Parliament, you don't have to go through a membership registration. And so they make laws for parties like us to make it very, very hard for us to meet the requirement of being a party, right? And so this is how democracy in Australia works. What is the frame of mind of these major parties in Parliament? They're looking at their primary vote plummet. Their primary vote's falling off a cliff. What's their response to their primary vote falling off a cliff? Is it to say, what do we have to change so we can go back to best representing the Australian people? Hell no. That's the last thing that's on their mind. It is, what do we have to do to rig the system so we can make it harder for other parties to take advantage of the fact that the public is turning against the major parties? That's how the system works. And so in our case, we met all the requirements. It was very intensive. And everything, as I said, is done on an electronic portal online with the Electoral Commission. And just after we've done that, then we get notified by the Electoral Commission that the old system of verification, thanks to bureaucratic snail pace, has not yet been dropped as a requirement. And so then we had to subject our members to the old system of verification as well. And the old system of verification in New South Wales is they contact a sample of 150. Now, that's very onerous, because of 750 members, they contact 150. At the federal level, where you have to show you've got 1,500 members, they contact 50. So this is already a very onerous system in New South Wales. But the only way you make sure that works is you've got to go back and call every single one of your members and make sure that they're ready for a contact from the Electoral Commission. And this is just because they haven't made the bureaucratic decision, oh, we've got a new system now, we don't need the old one. So according to the rules, the old one's still in place. So we've had to go through a double verification, and we've done it, but it was very, very intensive. And as soon as we finish doing this verification, Martin, they'll finish the bureaucratic process and they'll lift that old verification. So no other party will have to go through it, just us. Right. And this is a personal frustration for the Citizens Party, but it bespeaks a bigger problem, which is the way the system is rigged in this country. They've done the same thing federally. The two major parties have got together, the uni parties got together and rigged the rules federally so that they make it harder for other political entities to come in because they are losing their electoral support. That is how our democracy in Australia works. And then on top of that, if you haven't seen it, there's a really good, the biggest victim of Anthony Albanese's stupid under 16 laws, which come into effect tonight, right? Tomorrow?
Yep. Tomorrow.
Is the great Leonardo Puglisi from 6 News, the kid who started this news service on YouTube at what, he was 11 or something. And Leo's still not 16, I understand. Anyway, while it's up there, go look at his interview with Jared Rennick the other day and look at Jared Rennick's discussion about the state of democracy in the Liberal Party, and it applies to the Labor Party. And basically the state of democracy is they don't have any. Internally in the party, there is no democracy. So there's no way for the members to influence the policies of these parties. And when Jared tried to do that, they threw him out. When he challenged it in court, and he spent $600,000 of his own money challenging it in court, and all he was trying to do was get the court to rule that the party has to follow its own rules. The court ruled in favour of the party, arguing it doesn't have to follow its own rules. And the reason that's particularly important is because of all the seats in Parliament, there's about half of them that are safe seats on both sides. And so it doesn't matter how the vote goes in those electorates. Just the fact that the major party who has that safe seat pre-selects someone, that's the outcome. The pre-selection is the outcome. And that pre-selection for half of the seats in the Australian Parliament is not democratic because the two major parties control it, and it doesn't care they don't care what the members think. It's not even democratic in their membership. That is democracy in Australia. That's what we think is this great, wonderful thing. Right now, why is it so blatantly anti-democratic? Because they're not serving themselves per se. They personal reward comes into it. There's this force field, this corporate power that they all want to serve, and I think we've got to the point where they're also completely, they don't even care. Like they're so disconnected from reality, Martin. They don't even care how they looks anymore, because the proof of that is what happened today. There was a funeral in Sydney for a supremely corrupt person named Graham Richardson. And the Prime Minister of Australia went there and spoke at his state funeral. First, he gave this corrupt bastard a state funeral. And then he went and joined Liberal Party chums of this Labor Party crook to speak at the state funeral. And everyone knows how corrupt he was. The Sydney Morning Herald waited till the day he died to put out all the stuff that they knew about him because of how bloody corrupt he was. And they don't care. They don't care the whole country knows how corrupt he is, right? Because when the uni party is on the same page, they think, well, we'll just it doesn't matter. We're sort of protecting each other, right? And so what are they on the same page for? It's not just because they're just sort of degenerating together. There's something that is benefiting from this, and we've got to focus on cui bono. Who benefits? And it's this corporate power that's as much as anything a global corporate power.
Absolutely. And the sadness here is that a lot of people, of course, are not enough well educated about the way the political process actually works in practice, and really don't come across it until the election time. And there's a sort of a basic assumption that it's all fair and above board, and but this is important stuff for people to understand, that there is actually a whole subplot below the political processes, which is one of the reasons why we're in the problem that we're in at the moment, because effectively it's a disconnect, an absolute disconnect between reality and what actually goes on. But there's another angle here, Robbie, which I just want to bring in. Now, you mentioned earlier on this RBA question, the role of the RBA and its ability to do things or not, right? And the fact the Treasurer is trying to walk away from it. And ultimately, he didn't walk away, right? So, Treasurer still has the facility to be able to direct the RBA. Now, did you notice that the UN in their most recent, was it the UN?
IMF.
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 The IMF,
Yeah.
in their most recent status of the report on Australia's economy, which was very, very bruising, actually. They were really quite concerned about it. But one of the things that they called out was, you shouldn't have that power. So the UN, the IMF, we'll get it right. The IMF was actually once again sticking their oar in and saying, no, you shouldn't do this. Now, I want to highlight that we've got these global entities like the IMF and others too, the ones that actually are advocating the deposit bail-in, and some of these other things too. They are all predicated by two things. One, this same neoliberal philosophy, which is basically, that I can now say, is driving everybody from the UN down, because it's still the sort of the flavor of the month, right? Neoliberalism rules. And secondly, the way that those unelected global entities are actually sticking an oar in and effectively saying, no, do this, do that, And then, of course, politicians like in Australia sort of receive this from on high and say, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. And so the other sort of failure of democracy seems to me, this top-down dictation from some entity that has no real democratic mandate and yet can call the shots. So that's another factor that I think is also in the mix here.
And this is the real and the original globalism, because what one of the things that happens is a term comes up and people sort of slowly catch on to it, and then it gets overused and gets bandied around and overused, right? So, globalism, Trump overused, and becomes this overused term. The original globalism was a global banking power.
Yep.
And in fact, it's a really good read. If you go read the great Jack Lang's book on the battles in the Great Depression called The Big Bust, he describes in that book how the Bank of England, led by Montagu Norman in the 1920s, was trying to set up this network of banks. And the Commonwealth Bank was supposed to be part of that network of banks, all controlled in this web by the Bank of England. And this is how the empire the financial side of the empire would be run, right? With the Bank of England controlling all the central banks of these countries. And then that did turn into what became the Bank for International Settlements. And at first, the Bank of International Settlements was set up to help, recycle Germany's World War I debt, but it became this globalist thing straight away, and that was the original globalism. And the IMF has been an instant segue out of that. The Bretton Woods Agreement actually envisaged the IMF to be something other than that originally. It was supposed to be like a short-term way that countries, because they tried to manage fixed exchange rates, and that works when there's stability, but any given country, like a poor country, can have a famine and fall into difficulty. And the IMF was just to be a short-term way to lend them money, keep them going until they can get back on track and support their currency. When the Bretton Woods system ended in 1971, and that whole mechanism was gone, the IMF became this different beast, and it became an enforcer of there's actually a term for it called the Washington Consensus. It became an enforcer of the Anglo-American financial order, and it would go into countries that were in debt, supposedly to rescue with them. And in order to rescue them with loans, it would dictate to them, well, you will do this, this, and this. And that all those things it demanded were essentially neoliberal reforms, such as privatization, deregulation, opening up their economy to foreign investment, what they called foreign investment. But who were the foreign investors, right? They were, European and American banks and mining companies and whatever, and buy all their resources. If you've ever read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, right, he has a really good description of the process in action and how this sort of stuff works. That's what the IMF did and became this dictator. Now, in Australia, though, we have this really unique mechanism. That's why we're so proud to fight it and win last year, because when what Jack Lang was describing was happening, this led to a massive fight in Australia. We were in the Great Depression. We had 33% male unemployment. Families were starving. The Labor government, led by a smart guy named Ted Theodore, who's actually a real good mate of Bob Katter's grandfather, because that's what comes from the same part of Queensland. Ted Theodore said to the Commonwealth Bank, issue £18 million, 6 million to farmers, invest in farmers, buy their goods, 12 million for public works. Let's get these 33% male unemployment. Let's get them jobs so they can actually afford stuff. And the Commonwealth Bank was in this league with the Bank of England, and the head of the Commonwealth Bank said, I bloody well won't. I don't answer to you, the government that owns my bank that I'm managing. I answer to a higher power. That's actually what the mentality was. And so that led to the 1937 Royal Commission on Banking, which was set up to look at this particular issue. Who is the authority? Who should be the authority in the financial system? And that Royal Commission concluded, well, if we're a democracy, the authority has to be the parliament, and the government is the executive of the parliament. And so that was handed down in 1937, that conclusion. The Menzies did nothing to implement it, but when Curtin and Chifley came to power in 1945, they implemented it. And by passing what became Section 11 of the RBA Act in 1945, they were basically instituting this mechanism whereby that if there's ever a dispute between the management of the bank and the elected government, if it can't be resolved, then the will of the elected government must prevail over the views of the unelected bank if we are a democratic system. And that's been in place. It's never been used. It's been in place ever since. But for some reason in 2022, when Jim Chalmers set up his RBA review, and then it handed down its findings its recommendations in 2023, there were 50 recommendations. The first one was to repeal this power that had never been used in 70 years or nearly 80 years. Huh? Right? And I'll tell you why. We would have talked about this at the time. The reason that was the first recommendation, and the reason the IMF is still harping on about it, is because they know in these economic times, Martin, that you and I have just been talking about, how do we make democracy work over government policy? We've done everything we can do. How do we make it work? But as things get badder, worse and worse and worse, eventually you can reach a breaking point politically, and it forces change. And they want to take away the mechanism that might force the government to step in and overrule the RBA and say, no, it's time to use the RBA as a national bank for the good of the economy. The RBA has the power to act as a full national bank. It can carry on full banking services. I mean, it gave Michelle Bullock her home loan, for crying out loud. If it can give Michelle Bullock her home loan, it can provide cheap home loans for every Australian to build new homes with, right? And not drive up the existing house prices. It could do that. Just like the State Bank of Victoria did back in the day. It built 5,000 homes in 1921, the State Bank of Victoria. Pro rata and pro population today, that's like 80,000 homes in 1 year, built by a public bank, right? Albanese can't get out. I don't even know what he's getting out a year. It's something like, I don't even know if it's in the hundreds yet, what his stupid Housing Australia Future Fund has produced. But anyway, so you've got the IMF is part of this international network that includes the Bank for International Settlements and includes these really powerful central banks like the Bank of England that want to have this ongoing power, and they are freaked out that little old Australia has this mechanism whereby if we, the people, do our job right and force the government to act for us, then that can overrule the banking power and not the other way around.
Yeah. And that's the point, really, isn't it? That, again, there is talking about these invisible force fields, right? There's a force field around policy in Australia because of the corporates and what they can do, but there's another force field which is coming through from these international organizations, unelected organizations, but funnily
Yeah.
enough, all sort of mind melded to the same philosophical approach to the way the economy should work, which is effectively, as you said, to, privatize the bilio out of it and, make sure that all these private corporations can make massive profits. And, well, if you make losses, well, we'll have to sort of, charge those back to the people, of course. So,
That's right.
it's a crazy set of policies, and yet the number of times that I hear when I chat with politicians, well, this was recommended by that organisation or that organisation internationally. So I was talking to somebody the other day who actually used to work in Treasury in Australia, and interestingly, the Treasury in Australia takes its lead also from these same international organizations. So the thinking within
Yeah.
Treasury, which is supremely neoliberal in its philosophical approach, again, it's because it's this echo back to those international thoughts. So, when you start pulling this all apart, what you realize is that the perception of political reality is actually very different from what actually is going on, which takes us then to the final part of the conversation. So what needs to change? How do we actually shift gears? How do we actually move into the situation where the political process actually supports the outcomes of ordinary Australians, ordinary people, as they try and get by with their lives and their families? And how do we get back to the point where their wealth actually is perhaps protected and supported rather than the wealth of the big corporates or the international players? Because that's the critical question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I have one bit of advice about what not to do, and if I can use an analogy that is sort of from my upbringing, but some people might recognize it. Um, I had a fairly religious upbringing. One of the books I read as a kid was A Pilgrim's Progress, and very famous old English book by an English author, John Bunyan, in the
Yeah,
1500s
yeah,
or
yeah.
something. Anyway, the essence of the story is that they want to get to paradise or heaven or whatever, but there's all these obstacles on the way that they've got to avoid, right? And they, of course, they don't, and they have to, how do they get out of them and whatever. But it's like, it's what most computer games are. So what are the obstacles? Well, I just want to I want to quote the great Andy Schmulo here, because I was at an event the other night, the other week, and Andy spoke to our members, and he has a bit of a theme, which I think is a really good theme. And he said he made the point that he said, I'll tell you what's not destroying your lives. It's not what's not destroying Australia. It's my pronouns. It's the pronouns I use. And he was making a point. He was taking on the Sky News set, right? That it's all about the culture wars. You can get into this stuff, and they make it all important, and it's not actually the issue, right? It can seem really important, but it is not what is destroying the very fabric of your life, which is this: we have a society can only function if it's invested in, if it's got systems that support our living standards, and those things require investment, they require maintenance, etc. And those things have been systematically broken down and taken away from us, these services. And those are the other stuff is noise at the side. For anyone, there might be any one person where it's a particular issue, whatever. But he's talking about it as a political principle, and I think that's an important starting point, because we have the power. The people do have the power. The great English poet Percy Shelley wrote this spectacular poem after what was called the Battle of Peterloo, in 1719 or something. There was this terrible event in England where Lord Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, was sent in with troops to put down this political uprising against the poverty that the English people were suffering, and they massacred a whole bunch of people. And Lord Wellington did it with his troops. They just massacred them, and it became known as the Battle of Peterloo. And Shelley was in Italy, the great English poet Shelley, and he wrote this poem called The Mask of Anarchy. Look it up. It's a really long poem. And he describes in great detail the characters, the political characters of the day. I met death along the way. He had a face like Castlereagh, right? This sort of thing. But it's the way he ends that poem, because he's just described how oppressed the English people are. And he says, but rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. And that right there captures the political reality that's been true for all time. The people are the many. And the power of the few depends on keeping the many divided and conquered, right? And you divide them and conquer them by these political distractions. If the people actually focus on the economic things that affect us all and solutions for those economic harms, right? You have the potential to unite the most people of all around those solutions, and you can overthrow this whole system. And I mean, that's the principle to bear in mind. And so I can tell you, and I will tell you, I'll tell you, all your viewers, get on the Citizens Party website, join us, right? Because you're not going to get this kind of discussion from other parties. That, I mean, I'll make a few exceptions. I'm in close discussion. Jared Rennick has entered Australian politics like a breath of fresh air, because he's come from the Liberal side to the same conclusion as the Citizens Party, which is we need a national bank. I stumbled across this random bloke on TikTok the other day, putting up these TikTok posts about the Australian economy, and every post comes back to we need a national bank. And I reached out to him, and he's not part of any particular group. He just knows that this is a really key thing that we've got to do: break the power of the banks in this way. Bring back go back to this era before privatization, all that. Bring back some public investment in the economy and public institutions. But we can build a force around this set of ideas. Our party, Jared, is about to launch a campaign called Save Our Super, because we're just terrified of the idea of $1.4 trillion of Australian super being earmarked to make America great again. Because what's it going to invest into? It's going to invest into something that's now, some people describe it as the triple bubble, right? Which is the bubble of AI, crypto, and US government debt all together, all combined, that people like, well, go back and watch The Big Short. Michael Burry, the headbanging doctor in The Big Short, he got that bet right, and he's the one that's warning this triple bubble is going to burst and be much bigger than the global financial crisis. And we're earmarking our super to go into that. And if it's not exposed to that, what's that else is going to be doing? Well, the only thing that is productive in America is its weapons industry. Not that Boeing's any good anymore. Boeing is the biggest is the biggest company in the American military industrial complex. It can't make a safe plane to save its life. But that's America's main trick, right? It's weapons. So your super is going to be exposed to weapons of war that are designed to kill masses of people. When what could it be doing? It could be investing in Australia, right? We are terribly in need of investment in this country. We need investment in infrastructure. We need investment in industries. We have so many industries we lose in this country because no one wants to back them. And if we actually back them here, we would have flourishing industries in those areas. We need investment in housing. We need a massive public housing investment in this country, bring us back to the levels that we used to have. That's one way to start to tame the housing market. Make sure that young people can actually get houses, because you make affordable houses for them, and you do it at scale. But you can issue government bonds to invest in these things, and the Australian people can be the investors, right, to things that actually improve the country. Instead of what this stupid scheme with Donald Trump is going to do. So we'll have a campaign around that, and do these things to systematically show the public where we're being screwed and what the solution is. And I think, so that's in the specific. You can have a look at it, be convinced, get on board and join the party, but keep at the forefront of your mind the principle. right? What can unite the people? Because once the people are united, there's nothing that can stop us. And if you think that through, you're not going to unite the people around these culture war stuffs. It's not going to happen. Just live and let live, agree to disagree, right? But what do we all have in common? You know, you can be the most conservative, straight-laced person or the most flamboyant drag queen. Our government banking post offices will serve you all, right? You'll all get a good bank account. You won't be bailed in. You won't be debanked, right? And you can have proper financial services and affordable loan to buy an affordable house. How's that?
And that's the point, Robbie, isn't it? That there is actually a basic formula here that actually could have a very different tenor to it, right? We are actually in Australia a very rich country at one level, but it's not working for ordinary people at the moment. So therefore, we need to find a different path. And that path does actually still exist out there in the future if we want to grab it, but only if, one, we wake up to how things really are rather than how the mainstream is spun, particularly the political spin, as we discussed earlier on, and realize that there's actually a different set of truths that need to actually underpin the way forward. And that really is, what I try to do here on DFA and Walk the World is to highlight some of these philosophical conundrums that we have and what needs to be thought about differently. Because I actually think that learning some different ways to think is part of this. Don't just take what the politician says at face value, pull it apart and say, well, hang on a moment, the data isn't actually telling you that, right? But then it has to also be connected with momentum and transformation and change. And that's, of course, where the political processes come in. And that's why the conversations with Gerard and yourself and other people too are all part of this same sort of idea of trying to actually say there is a valid alternative future that does exist. The future's open, but only if we take ownership of it.
Yep. And I think have take responsibility as citizens. I mean, our slogan is that citizens taking responsibility, but understand that, if you want to make a slight allowance for the politicians, they're sort of products of a system that's been conditioned now. They're conditioned in this way. And so all they think about is that soundbite for the media, but the soundbite for the media seems to work because they think that, well, it looks like it's placated the people who consume the media, right? So stop being that person that gets placated by the soundbite from the politicians. Don't play that game. Don't join the bullshit pylons. I mean, you're always going to get caught up in the day's political gossip, but just see through the system. Look for where the real crimes are. There's plenty of evidence, and there's a growing alternative media that brings this stuff to life. And look at the big picture. And I think it's up to the people to not allow themselves to be wittingly fooled. It's comfortable to allow yourself to be fooled. You think, well, I couldn't have done anything about it anyway, right? So I don't have to get out of my comfort zone. But no, we've got to, because and the way I think about it, Martin, is it's hard to maintain the rage all the time. I might look like I'm more. I save my anger, my worst outburst for this show.
You do it very well.
But what happens is, and I think I hope people can relate. So you're going on with life. You focus. You've got a lot of things to do on any given day, and you focus on that. And then some bullshit part of political reality impinges on your reality, and you focus on it a bit, and you get really bloody angry, right? Because you think about why they do this, etc. And it's actually staying tuned into that, capturing that sense, and saying, no, I'm not just going to have an angry outburst, call up Talkback Radio and yell at the host, right? And then have a bit of road rage on the way home, hope it doesn't go too far, right? And then get home, have a beer and forget about it. right? No. These are things that have serious consequences. That's why I do get angry at things like the post office, because what I'm getting angry at is the experience of the little nonna who is on a walking frame, right, or a gopher, that her day, and I'll call it an honor in this area, right? Lots of ethnic grandmothers and whatever. Her day or week was organised around go to the post office, go to the newsagent, do those things, send money to the grandkids, pay the bills, etc., and that reality all gets taken away from her. Oh, remember I think I might have told you the story of the Glenroy post office. This post office, when Australia Post put out the brochure that said where the closest post offices were, the closest one is Airport West. But if you're a Melbourne person, you might get what I'm talking about. Glenroy Post Office is just off a little street off Pascoe Vale Road. Airport West is down the freeway. It's only closest as the crow flies. There's no direct way there that makes it closer, right? It's much farther away the way the road goes. It's literally only closest the way the crow flies. The arseholes at Australia Post who produced this brochure to tell the people of Glenroy that it's not so bad than losing their post office because there's one only 2 or 3 kilometres in that direction. They just did it on a map and, that's where the crow flies. Forget reality. And they get paid millions of dollars, these people, to do this stuff. Anyway, so we've got to change it. And, we've got to start with the crew that keeps tuning into Walk the World, Citizens Report. We'll get there.
Robbie, well, thank you. And, this is the last conversation for this year. I look forward to having you back on next year, and we will continue to fight the fight. If people want to find out more about the Citizens Party, where do they go?
Citizensparty.org.au, and especially click on the membership tab and join up at the moment. We're on a membership drive. We want you to be a member of the Citizens Party. You can subscribe, and there's also a place where you can subscribe to our weekly magazine where we put out our research. We do a lot of research in our office. And watch us on YouTube on the Citizens Report on YouTube, or I think it's just Citizens Party on YouTube. And if you're on all the different socials, I'm usually at Robbie Barwick. On TikTok, I think I'm at Robbie Barwick ACP. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. Anyway, just look it up. You'll see my ugly mug on videos somewhere telling you something I think you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Robbie, thank you so much. And I've enjoyed all the conversations through the year with intent, not just to have a conversation, but to drive change. And I would say that
exactly.
We will continue to push this agenda next year and drive the change for the benefit of ordinary Australians. Thank you very much for your time tonight. I'm going to take you off now, and I'm going to close the stream. So there you go. A very important and thought-provoking conversation with Robbie tonight. I hope you found that interesting and informative. Please like and share the post, as always. Next week, Leith Van Onsselen's on. We're going to have a last look at the economic story for this year, particularly with the interest rate shift that we've had in the last couple of weeks. That'll be quite interesting, I think, and get Leith's take on that. And we've got the doggies here. They've still been, wandering around a bit in between, but they're still, there you go, still there, ready for their next exciting part of the day, which will be lunch and a walk. So there you go. So thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next show, live show next Tuesday. And check out the recorded shows. We make shows each day of the week on politics and finance and economics and all of the things that we've been touching on tonight. Take care. We'll see you again soon. This is Martin North from Digital Finance signing off, and Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate it. See ya.